Right now, on a reef somewhere, there is a sponge. And no, not a discarded kitchen sponge. Well, there probably is one of those too, but rather, hopefully, an honest-to-goodness living sponge, which might also just be the most unique animal you'll ever lay your eyes on. It's got no head, no butt, no front, no back, not even a left or right. It's basically just a lumpy blob of cells sucking in seawater and straining out the food. And if you were to slice almost any sponge down the middle, in any direction you want, the two halves would not match up, because there's no line of symmetry to match them across. And yes, we have a name for this. You see, we sort animal bodies into essentially three basic layouts: radially symmetrical, bilaterally symmetrical, and then asymmetrical. And the sponge is the poster child for asymmetrical. And perhaps surprisingly, this has worked out great for it. Gloriously, actually, for hundreds of millions of years. In fact, for the greater part of 1 billion years at that. So that's all to say that being a shapeless blob with no aesthetic sense is a perfectly legitimate way to be an animal. And this is also what makes everything else so weird. Do me a favor and picture literally any other animal you want. A dog, a shark, a beetle, a bird, the person across from you, SpongeBob, but not a sponge, or yourself in the mirror, and draw an imaginary line straight down the middle. Notice anything? Well, assuming that you drew the straight line straight, you would notice that that line chops nearly every creature you could have landed on into two halves that mirror each other pretty much almost beat for beat. And I said picture any other animal because literally over 99% of all animal species are built symmetrically. So yes, while the sponge does show that symmetry is optional, the entire rest of the animal kingdom basically went and locked itself into symmetry anyways. And so that begs the question of why? Why is everything symmetrical? And here's the thing, the more you investigate that question, the stranger the occurrence looks. Because symmetry in the way we think about it, i.e. symmetrical axes, isn't something life happens to default to. Rather, it's something an embryo has to physically build while still being barely more than a blob itself. For example, take the head-to-tail axis. That patterning kicks off pretty dang early, during gastrulation and the start of neurulation, and it runs on a famous set of genes called the Hox genes, which you've probably heard me mention before. And the whole job of these is basically assigning parts to each chunk of the body. So essentially saying this bit's in the front, this bit's in the middle, this bit's at the tail end, etc. But figuring out head to tail is obviously not enough. We also need to know right and left, so we can always figure out what's a left turn by looking at our hands. Just kidding. Kind of. But jokes aside, right and left differentiation is actually kind of tricky, as a growing embryo has to somehow break its own blobby symmetry and commit to which side becomes the left, all the while keeping the whole a flawless mirror. And for example, in chicks, that call comes down to a small group of signaling molecules called SHH, nodal, and activin. And the key move here is nodal flipping on another gene called PITX2, but crucially only on one side, the left side. And PITX2 lights up in a sheet of tissue called the left lateral plate mesoderm. And it's basically the messenger that takes that abstract "this is the left" order and carries it out into the actual layout of the body. And before you ask, yes, it does differentiate the left side in a non-arbitrary manner, meaning that there is actually a true left. It's not just random. And that bumps the mystery back a step, because how does the embryo even know which side is left in the first place? And the answer is pretty cool. You see, in many vertebrates, including likely humans, there's a patch of tiny hair-like structures called cilia, tilted back toward the rear of the embryo. And these cilia spin, and that spinning drags fluid across the embryo in one steady direction. And whichever way that little current sweeps physically sets which side becomes the left. And we know it's the real tiebreaker because of what happens when you break it. As in mice engineered to lose those nodal cilia, the whole left-right call just gets basically randomized. And this system is so good at its job that even broken, it doesn't necessarily fall apart. In fact, there's a condition called situs inversus, where a person's organs develop as a complete mirror image of the usual setup, i.e. heart is shoved over to the right, the whole gastrointestinal system is flipped, etc. And tellingly, this condition often traces back to those same cilia not working. But notice something. Generally speaking, when this happens, the body doesn't just simply melt into the chaos known as asymmetry. No offense, sponges. Instead, what happens is, like I said, just a mirrored copy of the normal arrangement. So yes, every organ is in the wrong spot, but they're in the exact right wrong spot. And you might be thinking right about now, so okay, sponges are asymmetrical, but what about things like starfishes? Surely those weird looking things break the rule too. I mean, after all, they are all arms, have no obvious front, and most of them are arranged around the number 5, which is clearly not divisible by 2, which technically doesn't matter seeing you can have an odd number of mirror lines, but screw it, we're a clean divisible type of channel. So, clean exception, surely. And the answer to that is, well, no. Because echinoderm larvae, the baby sea stars and urchins and sea cucumbers, are actually bilaterally symmetrical, with a normal left and right. And it's only as they grow up that they decide to become heathens and rebuild into the 5-armed plus radial adult. So yes, not bilateral in the true sense, but cladistically, it is. So essentially, the radial symmetry look, i.e. the development of body parts around a central axis, versus a single central plane, which would be bilaterally symmetrical, evolved secondarily, meaning their ancestors were mirror-bodied, and the fivefold thing is a later, horrifying progression, if you will. Okay, that's cool and all, but again, why symmetry at all? And here's the honest, kind of anticlimactic answer, which is that symmetry is really just the consequence you get the second something becomes a thing that wants to move. And that might sound a little bit confusing, so let me explain. Think about what a body and evolution have to solve for, which is essentially life on a planet with axes and directions of its own. And as it so turns out, the world only hands you so many directions worth shaping along. For instance, gravity gives you the first one. Up is permanently everywhere and is different from down. So it makes sense to build a top that's different from a bottom. So there we go, we have one axis, handed to you by yours truly, the planet. And then movement gives you the second one, because the moment you start heading somewhere on purpose, the end that goes first stops being interchangeable with the end that drags behind, because the front is what runs into the food, the threats, and, well, everything else first. So evolution favors cramming your nerves and senses up there and bunching them into something called a head, which is a move called cephalization. And just like that, you've invented a real front and back, the anterior and posterior. So there we have the second axis, handed to you by yours truly, the desire to not sit in place for eternity. But now notice something here. Just like that, you're kind of out of axes. Because think about left or right. Is there anything that reliably favors an animal's left over its right? Or some force that keeps turning up on one flank and not the other? And the answer to that is no, there isn't. And as far as the environment's concerned, your left and right are dealing with the exact same world. So there's no reason to build them any differently, and therefore they came out the same by default. And so that's basically what bilateral symmetry is. It's the consequence of the other axes, the leftover axis if you will, and as it so turns out, a leftover axis just defaults to a mirror without any other sort of pressure. And once you see symmetry as the result of how a thing meets the world, the other two body plans just kind of fall out of the same logic. For instance, if you meet the world from every direction at once, but also have no desire to purposely move anywhere, being content with just floating around the water, you get radial symmetry, like the jellyfish for example. So in other words, a top and a bottom, but no real left, right, front, or back to speak of. Now, it's obviously messier than just a clean box because some things like comb jellies, the catenophores, aren't cleanly radial at all, being more rotationally or biradially symmetric, and even the cnidarians themselves, the jellyfish and anemone crowd, run the whole gradient from radial to biradial to nearly bilateral depending on what you're looking at. But regardless, you get the point. And then on the flip side, if you meet the world from every direction and don't even bother going anywhere, directed or non-directed, and then also split off from the rest of your kind way back in the day, you get our buddy, the sponge. And so that helps clear up a little bit of it, but it still doesn't answer the question fully of why directed movement specifically pushes for a mirrored right and left in the first place, and not something else. And the textbook answer is that bilateral just plain beats radial for directed locomotion, because a body with a front, a back, and two matched sides is way easier to steer in a straight line. And the more interesting answer that is derived from this, from biomechanics, is that being bilaterally symmetrical is the only kind of animal symmetry that's streamlined in one direction while staying unstreamlined in the others, which, in other words, allows the organism to throw maximum force into changing direction. And so in plain English, two matched sides is what lets a moving animal turn on a dime. And maneuverability is kind of important when you're chasing dinner or trying hard not to become it. Now on top of that, there's also the additional reason, which is that a mere body is just cheap to encode. You see, you write the genetic instructions for one side, and the other side just runs off of the very same set. And so you get a whole complicated half of an animal without ever paying for the information twice, so to speak. And it also stacks, because any tweak, any improvement that lands in that shared instruction set, shows up then on both sides at once, which means that you don't have to wait around for the same lucky mutation to strike twice in two separate places. Just once is enough. So on top of just falling out of movement, symmetry also happens to be a dirt cheap way to encode the body, which is also why it occurs, because it just happens more often in the first place. And if you want to understand when these two things first showed up together, the desire to move directionally and being bilaterally symmetrical, you can find it clearly in the fossil record. You see, the giant group of all these front-having, side-matching animals belong to something known as the bilaterians, which split into the protostomes and deuterostomes. And one of the oldest bilaterians we've ever pulled out of the ground is this little ediacaran critter called Icaria wariutia. And while being a small, simple thing, it did have a genuine front and back, and a mirrored left and right. And the really juicy part is that it's tied to movement, because this little guy was on the go, shoving through the mud and displacing sediment over 555 million years ago. Now, I will say that at this point, I should mention that the movement story being a cause of bilateral symmetry is simply the front-running hypothesis, so to speak, as there is another camp that believes bilateral symmetry might have actually shown up first in some no-good, sit-still, seafloor-bound animal as an easier way to push fluids around inside its own body rather than push the body through the world. So yeah, basically symmetry is just the default answer after accounting for what makes sense. And as such, the genuinely weird and interesting move is the opposite one, being lopsided on purpose. Because if being aesthetic and not grating on my eyes is free, then breaking that mirror costs you something else besides bad luck for 7 years, as you have to actively override the, again, cheap default. And you can watch it play out on the family trees, because when you trace lopsided animals back up their lineages, the asymmetry almost always turns out to be a newer invention slapped onto ancestors that were perfect, in other words, symmetrical. And perhaps nobody's a better example of that than the flatfish, our loppy, crooked, flapjack-looking friend. Now, perhaps unsurprisingly, given what I just said, a flatfish doesn't hatch that way. It starts life as a totally normal, mirror-image little larva, but then it goes through an extra round of post-embryonic remodeling during metamorphosis, where something slightly nightmarish happens, and that is that one of its eyes slowly migrates across the skull to the other side of the head, so that the grown fish can then flop over onto its side on the seafloor with both eyes now aimed up at the water above. So basically, cosplaying as a scaled rug on the seafloor. But grudgingly, I do have to say that it obviously works for it. And while this is perhaps the best case of asymmetry people know of, it is by no means the only one. For example, male fiddler crabs lug around one massively oversized major claw that they fight with. So in other words, one is massive and the other is small. Then you have the narwhal, the so-called unicorn of the sea, which obviously has their very famous tusks, which in reality is just a tooth. And specifically, it is the left one drilling straight out through its lip. And while most males just have one, some can sport two, and then others just none, which honestly makes the weirdos the ones that are more perhaps less weird in the grand scheme of things. But before you get all smug about being a nice, balanced, symmetrical human, bad news, because you're one of the crooked ones too. Because while your outside is a relatively tidy mirror, sure, your insides are a whole different story. Your heart leans off to the left, your liver camps out on the right, your gut is coiled in a specific direction, etc. But that doesn't determine if you're bilaterally symmetrical or radially symmetrical. I just wanted to take you down a peg. So to conclude, basically life is symmetrical because that's what makes sense. I know, massive shocker. The cool thing though is that given how the constraints and axes we mentioned work and how they would likely stay consistent across all planets, it's not crazy to think that any aliens we might meet would be bilaterally symmetrical as well. I will say though that they probably don't look like Clark Kent. Probably. Thanks for watching, and until next time.